He is no fool who gives up what he cannot keep to gain that which he cannot lose. He is no fool who gives up what he cannot keep to gain that which he cannot lose. Hear that again. He is no fool who gives up what he cannot keep to gain that which he cannot lose. This is a quote from a man who passed away many years ago named Jim Elliot. Jim Elliot, Ed McCulley, Pete Fleming, Roger Udarian, and Nate Saint dedicated their lives to bringing the gospel to one of Ecuador's most violent tribes, the Wodani. 1955, they and their families with their young infant and toddler children moved to Shelmera, just outside the Amazon rainforest. They made contact late that year by flying Nate's plane overhead. And on a rope with a basket, they would drop down gifts and things to this tribe. Nate could fly so well that he would fly basically in such a circle with the rope that he could basically keep the bucket at the very end because of the way that it was weighted pretty still. And they could reach in, this tribe, some of the folks, and they could take the gifts that Nate and many of the others had brought them. They decided just down the way, little ways from where the Wodani village was, that Nate had enough beach area there off of the Amazon River that they could land the plane. So on January 2nd, 1956, they did. They got to meet several different folks. These savage tribesmen were so enthralled with this flying machine. Brought them some different foods to let them try. Even shared some different clothes with them if they wanted to have it. Somewhere along the way, one of the ladies that had met these 5 missionary men, on her way back to their village, got into an argument with one of the most aggressive men in the tribe. This man had already killed off his first wife because he did not care for her. He basically thrown his second wife away, and he was going to have this lady no matter what as his next wife. Somewhere in the confusion, she made up a lie that blamed these 5 white missionary men. And a group of these tribesmen took their spears, went to where these 5 men were on the beach, and speared them to death. Everyone knew that the Wodani were a very, very violent tribe. Generations of murder had taken place with these folks over and over and over. Some of Nate Saint's closest missionary friends in other areas of the world were begging Nate, take your guns with you. Take your guns with you. Please be ready. Marge Saint, Nate's wife, on January 2nd, when they were getting into the plane to leave, she said, I knew in that moment that was the last time I was going to see my husband. Said, I don't know why, I don't know how. She said, I just knew. When Nate was asked to respond if they would defend themselves, Nate's response was, we do have the guns with us. But we're ready to meet Jesus, and the Wadani aren't. After some grieving, Elizabeth Elliot, Jim's wife, Marge Saint, Nate's wife, and Rachel Saint, Nate's sister, decided that they were going to carry out the mission that their husbands and her brother had given their lives for. They decided that they were going to move into the villages, or into the village with the Wadani tribe, and they did, with their infant and toddler children. They were going to move into a village knowing full well that many of the men in that village were the very same men who murdered their husbands, who murdered the fathers of their infant and toddler children. As the story continues throughout the years, Nate Saint's daughter ended up being baptized in the Amazon River by one of the very men that murdered her dad. Nate Saint, his son Steve, who was also living there, ended up in many ways raising his own kids there, and his son Jamie calls a man named Minkaye, who is one of the men that killed his dad. Nate's grandson calls him Papa. And when Jamie graduated from college just a few years ago, Minkaye was his sponsor, his escort for his college graduation. You see this story begin to take place in these women who were able to find freedom from so much grief and hurt and pain that they would move their families into the very village of the men who murdered their husbands. In late 1993, I got to meet Rachel Saint. And we got to hear that story directly from her mouth. And even almost 40 years later, there were aspects of the story she could not get out without tears. During the early 2000s, Steve Saint and Minkaye, who is now a preacher and an elder in the village, who is working to help the other villages find the gospel of Jesus. These two men traveled across the United States to proclaim what the freedom of Christ can do for people. I want to read you this text this morning again. Galatians chapter 5, beginning in verse 13. And we're going to read a little bit longer. For you were called to freedom, brothers and sisters. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for self-indulgence, but through love become slaves to one another. For the whole law is summed up in a single commandment: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. If, however, you bite and devour one another, take care that you do not be consumed by one another. Live by the Spirit, I say, and do not gratify the desires of the flesh. For what the flesh desires is opposed to the Spirit, and what the Spirit desires is opposed to the flesh. For these are opposed to each other to prevent you from doing what you want. But if you are led by the Spirit, you are not subject to the law. Now the works of the flesh are obvious: fornication, impurity, licentiousness, idolatry, sorcery, enmity, strife, jealousy, anger, quarrels, dissensions, factions, envy, drunkenness, carousing, and things like this. I am warning you, as I warned you before, those who do such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. By contrast, the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. There is no law against such things. And those who belong to Christ Jesus have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. If we live by the Spirit, let us also be guided by the Spirit. Let us not become conceited, competing against one another, envying one another. How would you define the freedom of Christ? How would you define that? I think history tells us that almost in every case, freedom is about freedom from oppression, freedom from tyranny or persecution, freedom from some sort of evil. Humanity has fought wars, countless wars, over things like this. On a daily basis, tribes in Africa are still destroying one another over things like this. In 2013, still doing this. And I think that is the issue that so many of us perceive in the concept of freedom that we have. It's freedom from something. And so in having freedom from something, it means that when I have freedom, you can't tell me what to do. I get to make that decision, and I get to do with my freedom what I want to do with that freedom. Some of you have raised kids, and you've seen how'd the college years go for some of your kids. How'd the college years go for some of us? Wasn't that exactly what, in some cases, college was? It was freedom from rules, freedom from somebody overseeing us. Sure, we didn't make any bad decisions during that time. And you look at freedom, and the problem here is, and this is the problem, this is the struggle, this is the issue that Paul is trying to share with the Galatian churches here, is that if freedom is never anything but freedom from something, it becomes an incredibly self-centered life. Because at the heart of everything will be what I want to do and the freedom I get to wield. Did you hear the contrast and the complete two-sided, both sides of the spectrum are here. You've been given freedom so that you can become slaves. What? Aren't we leaving slavery? Isn't that the point of it? I mean, back in verse 1 of chapter 5, that's what he says. If you go back to verse 1, you've been given freedom so that you might get out from under the slavery, out from under sin and death and the destruction that those things bring. And then he continues in the same chapter, but I'm telling you that the freedom of Christ is about becoming slaves to one another. Freedom for something. Freedom for the divine, grand purpose of God. See, I find it interesting. Right before we left Lubbock, probably about, I don't know, maybe a year or so, they built a brand new Barnes & Noble right there in the mall. Huge store. Insane how many books they have in there. You get up to the second floor of this. You start looking around, and over here on this wall is this enormous section on self-help books. I mean, it's enormous. If you would like to write a self-help book, I'm sure somebody will publish it, because there were tons of them. And over here in this small little section off to the side was a section entitled Spirituality. Name a religion. And it was there. And we start looking at what it means to be a follower of Christ and what it means to live in a world where, let's be honest, people are looking for the meaning of life and the purpose of their life at every turn. And part of the reason so many folks are so enslaved to sin is because in their desire to find that purpose, they filled their lives with things that just chained them to death. And then here is this struggle that I think each of us find ourselves in, and this is the interesting thing about the formation of the Spirit at work in our lives. We're so worried about not doing the wrong thing that we don't realize that our life has an energy and a divine purpose behind it, and so we better learn to replace it with something. And I think somewhere, even subconsciously, we know this. If the goal is just to stay away from bad things, that's not abundant life. That's not abundant life. That's not the conversation of setting your minds on things above that Paul talks about earlier. It doesn't seem to fit with the conversation of that you were created in Christ to do good works. Giving us creational theology there. All the way back to Genesis chapter 1. And I think one of the issues, one of the struggles here in the conversation is that they're finding a freedom from something. They're hearing maybe Paul say, look, the works of the law, they're not bad, but they're also not the end-all, be-all of what we're about here. The gospel of Jesus is not behavior modification. Hear me say that again. The gospel of Jesus is not behavior modification. If that were the case, Jesus doesn't need to come. We just continue to pass on the law to the next generation. That's what we do. All the behavior was taken care of there. The gospel of Jesus is about selfless love, regardless of the response of people. Regardless. Their response to how we love does not matter. What might our marriages look like if that's how we entered that covenant that Dwayne brought up earlier? Regardless of how she responds, I'm going to selflessly love her. Or our bosses, or our employees. Regardless of how they respond, I am going to selflessly love this person. Or those we are sitting across from, maybe, or maybe not wanting to see or talk to, even in this room. Regardless of how they respond, I'm going to selflessly love this person. It's way too easy to preach the freedom from you name it. And I will tell you that a huge part of the conversation for what Jesus was trying to do and has done and blessed us with is freedom from sin and death. But if that's as big as it gets, the purpose of your life will never be experienced. And I believe to a person in this room, you were divinely created for something bigger and better. Divinely created. You remember the words of the psalmist, knit together in your... I knew you. I knit you together in your mother's womb. I created you. And I created you in my image to bear my name. If you go back, for those of you who are Wednesday night, this will be familiar to you. Do you remember the name that God gives Moses? Love, faithfulness, slow to anger. That is the name that we bear. That is the witness that we have been divinely empowered by the Spirit to give. Somewhere in this, and we're going to look at this section next week as well, but somewhere in this, we have got to make the connection that surrendering ourselves to the Spirit of God daily, giving ourselves to God in prayer, daily giving ourselves to God in study of Jesus, His words, daily giving ourselves to some time of meditation, of reflecting upon who I am because of Christ. That is where the Spirit does its work and begins to produce something in us. That's where it takes place. And if the fruit of our life is a selfishness, if the fruit of our life, if we are struggling to have reconciled relationships here, if we are struggling to give love, to die to ourselves, to be a slave to another for the sake of Jesus. To be brutally honest, the question comes back to, how much time are you spending surrendering to God? Not because He or I or anybody else are asking you to muster up the ability, but because God gives us that through His Spirit when we surrender ourselves to Him. You ain't going to find a better self-help book than the gospel of Jesus Christ. And in receiving and living in life with God, He creates you into a person to be a slave to someone else. Grace does that. The Spirit of God does that. Come back to this story. Five missionary men. Dying for the sake of the gospel. And what is maybe more impressive to me than their sacrifice is that their wives would go back into those villages and convert an entire tribe to Christ. That within 1 year of those women living in that village, well over 95% of the violent reactions were gone. And this group of folks, this family had been so freed from their sin and so freed from doing it right to living out and through the Spirit. That they would be ushered into the kingdom in baptism by the very same men who murdered their dad. That their kids would grow up raising their kids to know these men and to call them intimate names like Papa. And that men like Mincaye, who had known only violence his entire life, is still preaching in the Amazon rainforest that dying to self and turning the other cheek is the doorway to abundant life. I don't want this to sound bad, but my personal issues that I have with certain people who tend to irritate me don't really seem to compare to that type of story. My frustration with not wanting to serve my wife simply because I'd rather sit on the couch doesn't really seem to compare to that story. And yet, this is the lead-in for next week. I have not been asked to muster up the ability to live out the faithfulness of Jesus Christ. I've been asked to give myself to the Spirit so that He might empower me for that. God has not asked you to do anything He has not already done, and He's not asked you to do anything He won't empower you to do. You've been given your freedom. I have been given my freedom in Jesus and through Jesus to choose slavery to others so that they might experience the beauty of grace. This is your God-created purpose. This is who we are. And don't think for a minute that you are not planting the seeds of the gospel for the next generation here and now. That's exactly what we're doing. I would love to look out one day and see Dalen Berry as a grown-up man being a vessel of grace for somebody else, knowing that many of you had given your life to helping him do so. And any other teenager or kid in this room, this is what we do. We pass on grace because it transcends everything. Here's the invitation. We want to serve you. We really do want to help in any way that we can, regardless of the sin, regardless of the struggle, regardless of the hurt, regardless of the pain, even if it's stuff you're just having a hard time letting go of. We want to help you do that because you have a divine purpose in this life. And that is to be a part of a community of people that live as vessels of grace for others. How do we help you do that? Let's stand and sing.